Hello, and welcome to our first lecture, Chapter 1. Uh, the lectures that we are going to be having throughout this course are based upon the information from your textbook Communication Between Cultures, as you can see on this slide. Uh, the purpose of our lectures are to introduce the information from the textbook and kind of go along with the textbook, but at the same time be able to add a little bit of discussion and enhancement examples so that maybe we can understand the information from another perspective as well. So we're going to be starting here with Chapter 1, and the title of Chapter 1 is Intercultural Communication, a Requirement for the Interdependent Global Society. We're going to start by talking about globalization. I know that all of you have heard the term globalization before. But if you were asked how to define globalization, it would be difficult to come up with an actual solid definition because globalization is a phenomenon that encompasses a whole lot of different kinds of elements. So the first that we're going to look at is the ongoing integration of the world's economy. What do we mean by that? We mean that if one country's economy is suffering, that is going to affect not just that country, but it's going to affect a lot of other countries. Any country that does business with that country, any country that may be close to physically that country, even indirectly for countries who don't do business with that particular country, but maybe do business with countries that do business with that country. I know that sounds kind of around and around, but let's give a couple of examples. First of all, a direct example. A few years back, well, several years back now, the Japanese experienced a nuclear and tsunami disaster. While we are not physically close to Japan, we do a lot of business with Japan and the United States. So, what happened to us and our economy? How did we, as individual consumers, feel their disasters? Because they were not able for a while to produce the goods and services that we are accustomed to purchasing. A lot of us who have Japanese cars were not able to get parts for our cars if our cars were to break down for a while, or we were able to get them, but they were more expensive than they were. Those of us who would like to have bought a certain type of car maybe found that that car wasn't available for a while. And not just cars, a lot of Japanese electronics and appliances are very common here in the United States. We were either not able to purchase those things, not able to fix those things, or those things were a great deal more expensive than what they normally were. And we would, may or may not have been able to find sufficient alternatives, at least for a while, until the Japanese economy was able to get back on its feet. So their disasters directly affected us as individual consumers here in the United States. Another good example of this is Greece. Greece is currently and has recently had some difficulties with their economy because, unlike Japan, we don't do huge amounts of business with Greece, but their economic difficulties were still affecting us because we do business with the European Union. We do a great deal of business with other countries within the European Union in addition to Greece. When Greece had its economic problems as a member of the European Union, they looked to the European Union for help. Any help then that the other European Union countries were to give to Greece were going to affect their economics and the way they structure uh, their business plans. Therefore, those things would then indirectly affect us, and it could be all kinds of things such as pricing, trade agreements, the types of materials or goods or services that were going to be traded or bought or sold in those countries. So whenever one country's economy is hurting, that doesn't just hurt that economy. It has far-reaching repercussions for all other of the world's economies because of how much we are interconnected. We also see a growing interdependence among governments and among individual citizens. When one government makes a decision for itself, unless it's a completely internal affair, which is uncommon, uh, generally speaking, that's going to affect the way other countries are going to be able to do business with that country, or going to be able to do business in that region, or going to be able to interact with the people within that region, especially if one of those decisions may have to do with human rights concerns. So if a particular particular government doesn't address certain human rights concerns, that may go up to concern or be a concern for groups, international groups like the United Nations, whereas then other governments will have to make decisions about how they are going to interact with that particular government based upon that particular government's decision. Many times, governments will make decisions having to do with international trade or uh, other international economic concerns that will, or even their own, the value of their own currencies, which will then affect everybody who touches that particular country. And our government may need to respond in a certain way based upon how the foreign country's government decided to do their make their decisions. So uh, we cannot act in a vacuum. Not will say most, but much of what our government does is reactive to what other governments do, and vice versa. We also are experiencing a more of a worldwide interconnectedness these days because of increases in technology, more natural goods and resources being moved from country to country, the increase in transnational corporations and trade and business that is done, not just between companies, but also between individuals. We have things like eBay, which can be international now. We have things like Amazon, which is international, so that I, as a consumer, can sit in my living room and literally order something directly from an individual person in India. I can have a dress tailored from a tailor in India, not going through any larger organizations or groups, but simply a transaction between two individuals. We also have concerns about things like infectious diseases because of the way that our technology is these days and the ease of transportation. We can literally have somebody who is infected with a disease in the morning, say, in one country, not know they're sick, get on a plane, infect everybody in that closed environment, who are going to multiple different destinations within the world, maybe making several different connections and ending up God knows where. We could literally have one person in the course of 24 hours affect multiple nations, or say infect people from multiple nations. And this is not isolated or strange or weird. This is the type of situation we deal with every single day. This is the chance that we take every single day. So infectious diseases are no longer something that we can just look at on a television screen or read about in a magazine and say, oh, how, so bad, how sad for those people over there, because those diseases can travel to us within the matter of a day or two if we do not have measures in place to protect ourselves or to identify these concerns and take care of them. And the only way that we can take care of these things is by working together as an international society. I would like to direct you to your textbooks, table 1.1 on page 4. You see here listed a good many concerns that will require the cooperation of many nations in order to solve. And these are some pretty significant concerns. We see them broken down into social challenges, ecological concerns, humanitarian and legal cooperation concerns, political questions, and security issues. Uh, the, ta- uh, the table brings out certain concerns such as population growth, urbanization, competition for natural resources, uh, responding to environmental changes and climate control, concerns about disaster relief, which we talked about in the beginning slide. Disaster relief is not just a concern with regard to economics, but it's also a concern as to what kind of aid are we as another country required to give to that particular country for humanitarian reasons as well as to protect our own economic interests. Disease control, something we also just discussed. Uh, how do we contain infectious diseases? How do we protect the spread of infectious diseases into other countries when it is we're so open to that kind of spread because of modern transportation capabilities? Also, concerns such as transnational crime. Cybercrime is a big thing now and knows absolutely no borders. The internet does not distinguish between our political borders. It goes everywhere, and cybercrime is a big concern. We have concerns over political questions, such as um, human rights issues. When one country either engages in a human rights concern or a behavior that is a concern or a violation of human rights, how do we, or do we at all as an international group, have some kind of reaction to that? Do we stop it? Do we interfere? Do we not interfere? And if we are going to try and stand together as an international group against human rights violations, what kind of control do we have? What kind of power do we have? Who has the right to make such decisions? Who's the right to take certain actions? These are things that cannot just be taken care of or answered by one or even just a few countries. It is something that an international coalition has to take care of. Uh, we have concerns over weapons of mass destruction. Who has nuclear capabilities, who can have nuclear capabilities, how do we or is it even impossible to regulate the use of such capabilities among those people who have them, or rather, should say those countries who have them. And this is not, again, just an academic concern, because if somebody were to become involved in a conflict with another country and they use certain weapons of mass destruction, those effects are not going to be contained by political borders. It isn't going to be just the problem of those two countries. It is going to be the problem of the entire world, because such weapons can affect environmental concerns, can affect our destruction, our economies. It is, again, just because of globalization and because of the nature of these types of weapons. It's not a concern for just the countries that are involved in whichever altercation is the concern at the time. Terrorism, obviously, almost by definition, is something that we see cross borders. I shouldn't say that, because terrorism is quite common within borders as well, but it is something that we see often, terrorism coming from cultures or countries that are different from our own here in the United States, as well as in Europe and all across the world. So that is something, since many of the terrorist concerns are coming from shared uh, shared enemies, if you will, or shared problems that we need to deal with, we're going to have to work together to combat those terroristic um, uh, origins. All right, we also need to work together on how to keep peace, right? Peacekeeping missions are very important because we want to avoid all the troubles that can come with conflict, not just having to as a coalition deal with the conflict once it begins, but how to avoid conflict from the beginning. We also need to worry about things such as the lack of knowledge that we have all over the world, and lack of tolerance of other religions. These, this lack of knowledge often le- uh, feeds into our conflicts. So we want to not just have cooperation for peacekeeping missions, but also learn together how to learn about one another, so that we reduce the amount of conflict that comes from a lack of knowledge of one another's cultures and what is important to each other. And again, this is not just a feel good, human relations kind of concern. This ties in directly to all these other security concerns that we were talking about. How our countries are going to be affected by conflict, how our countries are going to be able to work together economically. We are so much interconnected now that we cannot just look at each other over the side of from two sides of a wall and point the finger. We need to be able to learn how to work together, and that is impossible if we don't understand one another and are feeling hatred toward one another simply because we don't understand one another. And if you need, I think that there are some examples that should likely be obvious to you as members of a modern society. But for more examples, I suggest that you take a look at page 14 of your textbook. Here they have a very uh, good summary of many of the different kinds of concerns that we have in this country, that create conflict, that are based primarily upon the lack of knowledge or intolerance of other religions. So people who come from different religions who don't understand one another can actually cause a great deal more harm than just bad feeling toward one another. And lack of knowledge is something that we as a community can, as an international community, I should say, are in a position to eliminate. And eliminating that will eliminate much of the conflict and the fallout from those conflicts. Today's world is also seeing a growing trend toward what we term nationalism. Nationalism is around the world creating a trend toward an increase in negative ethnocentrism. We're going to talk a little bit later about what negative ethnocentrism is specifically, but for our purposes now, is basically, in this case, we are creating more feelings of an us versus them mentality, where we feel that we are better than them, whoever we are and whoever them is. This is becoming very common, more common than in the past in parts of, or in different parts of the world. We see it is growing in the United States, as well as in Europe, as well as in Asia, as well as in the Middle East. So this isn't just a concern for one region of the world. We're seeing this increase happening in many parts of the world. And the reason that this is a big problem is because of globalization. There is a quote in your book that I particularly like, and that's why I included it here on your slides. When faced with any nationalistically based call, one should always keep in mind that a fundamental function of nationalism is the creation of an us and a them. So when we think of nationalism and we think of it as equating to patriotism, it's really not. It's what it is it's creating greater divides between people. That is a problem because of globalization. If we are all interconnected economically, and in other ways as well, as we've discussed, politically, socially, creating divides between us means that we are going to be hurting ourselves as much as we're hurting other people. So this is a definite concern, and it isn't a concern, as I said, just for any one particular country or one particular region, as we're seeing this as a global trend that we need to look at, address, to try to understand the reasonings for, and hopefully to maybe turn around. Um, we also are going to need to work together when it comes to the influence of IT and social media on our lives. Because of our increased technology, our types of technology, we are more interconnected literally than ever before. We can literally talk to somebody and look at their face who is across the world from us as easily as we can sit and talk to one another face to face. Because of IT, I'm able to sit here and talk to you now. You are taking this class online as opposed to listening to this class in an actual classroom. So, because of this, it affects our cultures. It affects the way the increase in this more remote kind of communication is affecting the way we relate to one another, both within our cultures and across cultures. So there are a couple of different thoughts on how IT is affecting our cultures, and there is no one right answer to this. I just want to put these out here for you to think about. What do you think IT does with respect to our culture? Is IT or social media bringing us together in a way that we've never been together before? Is it allowing us to share our ideas, our values and beliefs, our cultures, so to speak, so that instead of becoming more different from one another, we're actually becoming more similar to one another, so that cultural distinctions are becoming eliminated? Uh, or is this actually dividing us more? Some people would argue that yes, it brings us together as a more of a global culture, because people who are not a part of my culture can experience my culture. So people in the United States can experience Japanese culture very easily through IT and social media. Uh, People in the Middle East can experience the Western cultures very easily through social media. We start wearing similar clothes. We at least recognize each other's clothes if we're not actually wearing them ourselves. We listen to music and eat food that is not necessarily from our local culture. And that way it brings us together, makes us understand one another more. But at the same time, does that same thing have the effect of dividing us on the local level, of picking apart our local cultures, so that a person who is living in one particular place, say I am Japanese and I'm living in Japan, but I feel disjointed from the Japanese culture uh, because I don't need to interact with that if I don't want to. I don't have to go outside of my own home to interact with that. So, because we lose that daily interaction or that daily interdependence upon the people who are physically closest to us, do we then lose our local and traditional cultures? Do we polarize from our within while becoming closer to other people, other cultures? Are we busting apart our own individual cultures? It's an interesting idea. I don't think that there's any one right answer to that. Quite frankly, I think it has. I think they're both true, in that it is creating a larger global society and making us less different from one another than we have been in the past. But at the same time, we don't interconnect as well with the people in our local communities simply because we don't have to. If a person is living in the United States or any other culture that simply doesn't really buy into the teachings of that particular culture, they can very easily find someone else who's going to believe some whatever they believe, which is which may be different from their local communities, simply by going online or by or finding other ideologies to adhere to without having to worry about what the people around them think, because they can isolate themselves well uh, from their immediate environments and finding comfort in society in a larger online environment. A lot of the people would believe that this is the cause of many much of the conflict that we have today, that many people who are behind these nationalist movements are so because they are concerned about the loss of um, their traditional beliefs, the loss of their traditional cultures, the loss of their local cultures, the very real phenomenon of these IT or social media that is, while bringing us together globally, is busting apart our local communities, our local traditions and cultures. People get concerned about that. We've, for generations, relied upon our traditions and our cultures and our society. And when we see that slipping away, sometimes we have a knee jerk reaction, want to blame somebody. And as we start now playing the blame game and creating an us versus a them mentality that tries to preserve or hold on to the past by blaming the effect of somebody else. So you can see how all of these things are separate concerns and at the same time really kind of fit in together like pieces of a puzzle of a larger global concern that is going to have to be something that we all work together to solve. So, my question to you then would be, how do you anticipate your own personal involvement in this? And it's easy to say that we all need to work together, that we will all have to play a part as a global society in coming up with solutions to all these problems. How will you personally play a part? And again, I don't need you to answer that specifically, but I want you to think about it. If you are going into the medical field, you may be very much involved in working with diseases that are not necessarily native to your particular region. You may be very much involved in trying to eliminate the spread of communicable diseases, not just in your region, but to other parts of the world as well. If you are a politician, I guess that's kind of an obvious how you can be working with international concerns, but also with, not even if you're a local politician, you're going to be dealing with diversity concerns within your own communities, because intercultural communication isn't just communication between different nations, it's communication between people who are of different backgrounds within the same country. We have, if you are an engineer, you're going to be concerned with sharing ideologies on how to make whatever kind of engineer you are. I'm sorry, but you're going to want to share information. How do we share information, or yet how do we protect information? How much information do we share with other countries and other cultures? What how do we balance our own national interests versus the interests of the world at large? So you can see that, and if, of course, if you do business, we talked about a lot of economic things that you're going to need to be concerned about. Possibly you're going to be working for a transnational corporation, or you're going to want to start a transnational corporation. It's not difficult. An individual can do that, work in many other countries because of the IT, social media stuff that we have today. If you are going into IT, obviously that's a big one. IT knows no political boundaries. So, no matter what your background is, this is something that you are going to be directly involved in. This is going to be something that you are going to need to be concerned about. All right, so let's change gears here a little bit and discuss what intercultural communication actually is. Intercultural communication can be defined as the interaction between people whose cultural perceptions and symbol systems are distinct enough to alter the communication event. Now, as we go through the next couple of chapters, this definition will make a great deal more sense to you when we talk about cultural perception and symbol systems, as well as communication itself. But for now, let's discuss studying intercultural communication itself. How do we go about the study of intercultural communication? First of all, it is extremely important for us we cannot emphasize enough the fact that each individual is a unique person. All right. No one person is the carbon copy of another. No one person is going to be the same as another. We will share similarities, but we will not be the same. You are made up of a lot of different things, which makes you unique. Your genetics, your experiences, your language, your gender, your age, your family history, your political ideologies, your level of education, where you grew up, your neighborhoods, wherever. All of these things work together to make you a unique individual. And there is no one in this world, including even your own siblings, who are going to have the exact same experiences as you, and therefore there is no one in this world who's going to be quite the same as you are. That said, also we need to remember that while we study culture as a way of predicting behavior and perceptions, not no one person is going to be the exact mirror of their culture. So while their culture may affect a lot of who they are and what they think and what they do, no one is going to follow that culture. No one within that culture is going to be following that culture exactly to the T. The culture is a generalization of of the patterns of behaviors that we see within a group of people, and is not necessarily a picture of any one individual within that particular culture. So let's look at a little bit of what we do in the study of intercultural communication. We do a process called generalization. Generalizing is important to the study of intercultural communication, but it has its limitations. Generalizing is the practice of applying limited experience to determine or profess the characteristics of a larger population. So this goes directly against what we just said in the previous slide, that no person is going to be the mirror of their particular culture. So you may think, well, why bother to look at a culture if nobody within that culture is necessarily going to reflect that culture? The fact is that people will reflect their cultures to varying degrees. No one is going to be the mirror image of everything within that culture, may agree with some of the things, follow some things, and not follow others, depending upon their own other individualistic characteristics. But in order to understand people from a particular culture, we need to understand the common ideologies, values, and behaviors that many of the people hold, and which do affect the way they perceive their world and maybe the way that they approach certain situations, even if they are slightly different than what their culture would suggest. So this generalization, you may think that that sounds a bit like stereotyping if you know much about what stereotyping is, but this is different from stereotyping. Generalization differs from stereotyping because generalization must be based on some type of experience, not just a singular experience or a limited experience, but a much more generalized experience. Generalized observation, our study data, uh, data that comes from not just one person or two people's experiences, but experiences and observation that has been taken over a large course of time among a lot of different people, and taken it from a more academic perspective, not a biased perspective, but based upon actual study of the culture from an objective measure. Stereotyping, on the other hand, is often based on conjecture and is usually emotionally based. So a lot of times we have a stereotype that comes from limited experience with a particular culture, or experiences that are being defined by people who already have preconceived notions about a particular culture. So these stereotypes, while they may be true for certain members of a particular group of people, are not necessarily true about other members of a particular group of people, and are often incorrect because they are based on such limited information. Cultural generalizations, as I said, have their limitations. While we can use cultural generalizations to understand the influences on an individual, we cannot use them as absolute representations of a particular individual within a particular culture. Again, they must be used only as approximations or guides or ideas of what may affect that particular person's behaviors or that particular person's values um, or perceptions. As I have written here, they need to be used as the initial sketch, but they are not the final picture. So generalizations are the first step to getting to know somebody, the first step to effective communication with somebody. They are certainly not going to in and of themselves going to carry you through an entire communication or through an entire interaction with someone. You need to be able to use that as a guide to begin your communications and then treat that person as an individual. Limit generalization to the primary values and behaviors of a culture. Those cultures are those values which derive from what we're going to be learning is the deep structure institution of culture. That is family, state, history, and religion. These four deep structure elements of culture are those elements from which we get the most important teachings of our cultures, those that are more likely to be have a common effect upon our perceptions, beliefs, and behaviors. When we focus our generalizations on these lessons, they are more likely to be accurate than generalizations that are based upon other things that are not necessarily as valued or as shared within a particular culture. Keep in mind also that the accuracy of a generalization often depends upon the characteristics of the culture itself. For example, if you have a culture that is highly collective, and we'll talk about what that means again later on, but a group that would be a group that focuses on group conformity, all right, such as Japan or Korea. All right, they are more likely to have fewer variables in uh, between different individuals within that culture in the way that they think, act, and perceive situations. So if you do use generalizations in a culture that is highly collective or that does put a great deal of emphasis on group conformity, like these East Asian cultures, you're more likely to find that your generalizations are accurate when it is applying it to a particular individual or situation than in cultures that tend to have fewer similarities among their members, such as diverse cultures like the United States. In the United States, we are more individualistic. We are much less and concerned about conformity. In fact, we dislike conformity and fight against it, and therefore we as individuals tend to have more variables between us, more differences between us than people who are parts of groups that are of cultures that tend to focus more and put more emphasis on conformity. Therefore, generalizations, when applied to Americans, are not necessarily as useful as when applied to members of other societies that are a more collective, such as the Japanese. When we study intercultural communication, it is extremely important to show objectivity. Objectivity means to approach other cultures and ideas without bias and without the influence of emotions or personal prejudices. As you read this, you may think, well, that's okay. That's easy enough. I'm not a prejudiced person. We are all prejudiced in this sense, all right? Because we grew up in a particular environment, in a particular culture that taught us how to perceive the world around us, how to define our realities as good or bad or beautiful or ugly or whatever. We all have those lessons that are inherent in us that we don't even often think about. And to look at the world without those perceptive filters is extremely difficult. To be able to part those perceptive filters and to try to see see the world or see a situation through someone else's ideologies is extremely difficult, because that is asking yourself to do something that is not natural to you. It isn't just a feel good mentality or a good intention. That it is actually a skill that you need to learn how to cultivate, to learn how to do and to practice. And that's one of the goals of this particular class, is to try and teach you the skills to look at another culture, to approach another culture objectively, without looking at it through your own personal perceptive filter. One of the ways, more simplistic ways to say that you can do this, is to simply avoid being judgmental. The moment you make a judgment, you know that you are looking at something through your perceptive filter. Now, this isn't always a bad thing, okay? This is a natural thing. We have to make judgments and decisions and have opinions in this world. That is part of being human and living in a society and interacting with reality, right? So this is what we naturally have to do as human beings. But the moment we make a judgment on something, anything, we are using our cultural, historical, individual experiences to come to a conclusion. Things that are unique to us or unique to our culture. When we are doing that, then we are no longer being objective or looking at something from another person's culture, another person's perspective. So we have to try to avoid making judgments, reserve our judgments until we are able to gather enough information to be able to understand whatever it is that we're perceiving from the perspective of the person who is acting a particular behavior or professing a particular ideology. We need to be able to understand what that person's communication means from their perspective, rather than trying to figure out what it means from our perspective, if we're going to be able to clearly and accurately understand what is meant by that communication. All right, so chapter one, basically in this chapter we discussed what challenges we have in the world that require intercultural communication. So the why of why we are in this course studying intercultural communication, but also some of the challenges in studying intercultural communication. What do we need to do in order to study intercultural communication, and what our limitations are, and what we need to overcome? Why is it not just enough to have a good feeling about working with other people and communicating with other people, but why it is actually a skill that we have to work on in order to become effective intercultural communicators, and how important that is in today's society. So from here, we're going to move on then to chapter two, where we will actually start learning a little bit about intercultural communication, and looking at the elements, from the base elements of what that is and what that means, so that we can create the skills that we need to create in order to solve the problems that we discussed in this chapter.